Hi, thank you for watching my podcast. Today we will be talking with Marcus Luka. We talked about sentience, about consciousness. We talked about different species too. I think you're in for a good treat, and we kind of go all over the place. So I hope you enjoy, and thank you for Marcus for coming on. I also want to say that about 30 minutes in, the camera turned off for Marcus, so we'll have visual for the first 30 minutes or so, and then after that it'll just be audio. I'll throw up some photos so that whatever matches will kind of complement the audio. But I want to apologize for that, but thank you for watching and listening. All right, so we're going to talk about human nature a little bit, about consciousness. But to start that, I'm going to let you kind of give some ideas of what you define as a definition for what would be the line of where with human nature, free will, all these things. You can kind of go on this spiel about everything you think about that's important, sure. Right. Which it's a tangent on the topic we're talking about. So.
Okay. So kind of the main two ideas that I think are going to be important here are the idea of consciousness, because that's something that can be applied outside of humanity to a certain degree and be important to some extent. And the other one is going to be free will. That's a whole can of worms, right? What constitutes free will? What does the existence or non-existence of it imply? That's going to be kind of the crux of the conversation. Starting with let's start with, sorry, I'm drawing a complete blank. Starting with consciousness. There's been a lot of study into consciousness. Are animals conscious in a human sense? Where does that start in neural development when you're talking about the brain? How complex does a brain need to be for an animal to be conscious? Some people even talk about like plant consciousness. What does that look like? I feel like that might be a bit far gone for today's conversation. Where I would tend to draw the line is complex social behavior. At that rate, once you have existing memory and you can recall experiences and grow based on things that are not happening in the now, consciousness is more or less existent in that specimen. With a human, what defines us as conscious, what we consider consciousness, is the ability to observe the here and now and recognize what is around us as current. An animal, some hypothetical animal, may see consciousness as I'm here, so what of it? This is what I need in the moment. A human, what is now is contextualized.
Sure.
What do they expect to happen? What has already happened? Memory and anticipation are the key elements, because in the scheme of things, what's happening right now is 0% of what I've experienced. It's one slice of an infinite cake, right? That's the complex, overwordy answer. But if we're looking for a definition of consciousness, that's a complex enough topic to be worth a difficult
complex
answer.
Response. Yes. So I heard a couple of things that I find interesting that I do have questions related to. Do you think, because when you were talking about it, you said this awareness that when animals are making, where they're like, oh, it's purely more based on I need this, so it would be like, this is what I'm going to do. Would you consider it more of instinctive, where they're not really even making the decisions, it's just made, then right. In that case? I was just clarifying in that sense.
When I compare, even if we're not talking about humans, when I compare an ant to a dog, ants are, at least experimentally, purely instinctual. It's almost like they're programmed in a sense.
Basically, yeah.
There could clearly be some evidence I'm missing, something I haven't read or seen to prove me wrong.
They're acting based on the fact that they're never going to disown, or they're following the set standard. In some sense, if you want to say programmed, because it looks almost like a hive mind, right, where you're just following the one that's in charge of you, which would look like, rather than say they're all linked to one mind,
right,
they'd be linked to. They would be already, in that sense, look like they're programmed, or that's just the way that they're instinctively made.
I mean, like the eusocial insects. What is the Hymenoptera, ants, bees. I don't think that includes termites, but throw them in there
Sure.
too.
Sure.
They, for the most part, react instinctively
Mm-hmm.
to pheromones and naturally occurring scents and stimuli. That's a necessity to be considered a living thing, is reacting to stimuli, external stimuli. When a wasp nest is attacked, when you swat at a bee and they go back to the hive, they're not speaking and saying, hey, those human guys, you remember those? Yeah, one of them attacked me. No, they just
They know
say,
exactly
we're
what
in
it is.
danger.
Yes.
I released a chemical, and they're programmed,
Yes.
whether that's genetically or to some extent socially. I don't believe they're not a sense of belief as in like, well, faith as much as I don't scientifically, they're not trained. They're
No, they're just that way.
instinctive.
Yes. Yeah.
It would be awfully hard for them to train, considering that, well, like if I think like other insects, and these aren't eusocial, but like mayfly is a lot of aquatic larval insects die in the process of childbirth.
Mm-hmm.
They exist as larvae for the majority of their life. I don't know, what's it called? Pupating. They go to the next stage of life, and they don't even have mouths. They just have I have enough energy to live 7 days. I'm going to mate, lay my eggs, and then go die in the river.
Yeah.
You can't train there.
So the only way they will live is based on this instinctive stance where if you only have 7 days to live, you're not going to be trained to learn it. And as a result, every single generation knows exactly what's to take place. It's
genetically
not like you
coded
can't change
reactions.
it exactly. Where with some of it could be even where small adaptations with time where they've known that this is what would cause our previous form of self to die. So we will have to adjust ourselves this way, because it would still be micro. It would be like these miniature changes that are causing them because they do want to stay alive. That's right. It's a stance for instinctive behavior.
I think that's a misconception in biology, is this idea that animals want to stay alive. And that's not the whole story.
Sure. Okay.
They don't want to. Animals are designed to have fear and to value their lives, but it's not for the sake of living a long life. Sure. It's for the sake of reproducing. Whether you believe that's an entirely natural process or something endowed by a creator, that's clearly the purpose. They're supposed to be fruitful and multiply.
So do you think that, in some sense, I would still relate that it's as a result, if they want to reproduce, they want to live too. But that's not. It may not be the true source of why it's taking place. They also the only way to reproduce, because there is no sense of value to their life, but they also know that this is one thing that all of them do. It is interesting that they have this. It is this purely instinctive desire that is just there, where they demonstrate this care and hope for it, but you don't actually know. It's like they all do want to do this. It's not just like they're acting out of pleasure or anything. They're all.
Well, when you tie that back into the eusocial insects, ants, bees, wasps, and whoever else wants to be in the club, right? The worker has no instinct, no desire to live. You see, there are instances where I'm sure you've read about parasitic molds affecting ants. It's not germinating, but they release their spores. The spores get eaten, and those ants are taken over and controlled by chemicals produced by the fungus to return to the colony and pop and get more spores inside of the colony. And now you have a spore factory with thousands of units. And so they post guards. There are guards posted at the doors who will find ants, sniff them out, say, hey, you have a spore on you. We're going to grab you, drag you to the graveyard, and all three of us are going to die so that we don't contaminate the rest of them.
They have no true desire. It's not even sacrificial. It's more this is the only way it is.
Right. Because if we value our individual lives, the colony will die. That's in a sense.
But they don't also have the incentive to desire their own life. They have but they also don't. That's very true. Actually, that's the only relation to, if you were to relate it, because then it's like, well, they wouldn't have the desire to live from the fact that they can't reproduce. They
Right.
aren't seen as valuable. That is the source of value
Everything
in
protects
natural.
everything is to protect the queen.
Yes, because that's the only thing that can cause the hive to develop and to stay alive.
Stay
It's
alive.
the only truth of, I guess, because I didn't even relate, because when you look at all the other animal kingdom, it is these pairs where everyone is in, has an involvement besides these.
Well, you also have to think about how much of an investment the queen is. The queen is constantly fed, they're constantly guarded, and in species like termites, they can live 20, 30 years. That's a massive investment, and it's not something that you can replace. It's not like there's only one species of eusocial mammals. They're native to South Africa. They're called naked mole rats. They're weird animals. The queen chemically castrates all of the other animals, females and male, with a chemical in her urine. She goes all over the food, and they can't produce offspring. And they exist tunneling around.
But they would have. So it's not like they have, like with some of these other ones where they don't physically have the capability. It's almost like it was taken from them.
Yeah, and when the queen dies and stops misting all over the vegetables, they start reproducing
again. Do they all
and
become their own queens? Or
theoretically, but once a dominant grows and becomes fertile again, she starts going all over the vegetables.
So does this give all the power to a queen? What would be the instinctive or
it's purely social?
Okay. I just mean like if in the sense where is there some sense of power? Because it's like she's not a queen wouldn't desire power, but it would also be that if there, it kind of does go, I would think it goes against the stance of what they would want instinctively. Because if you're like, if all of us were to reproduce, we can easily cause our community to largen, and we're not going to be so dependent on one thing. So what would cause...
The eusocial insects have figured that out. There's colonies with 20 to 30 queens in them.
Okay, there you go.
But
I just find it interesting that they're choosing... one person would choose this.
If we're talking about consciousness,
yes,
the naked mole rat, that's still weird to say, is interesting because they are mentally developed enough to possibly have conceited ideologies where, and I'm not speaking from a
morality
scientific study necessarily. Okay. I'm saying that they have more complex brains than insects, which isn't that big of a feat.
That's not that big of a surprise. Yeah.
But they're rodents,
yes,
I think, or maybe marsupials. It doesn't matter. They're a small mammal.
Sure.
They have a far more developed brain than the insects have. And that possible desire to elevate yourself over the colony, where you have if a queen has a conceited ideology and she says, no, I want to be the queen because the queen gets treated great. The queen gets all the food, all the boys. Sure. Ants aren't developed enough to be conceited.
To recognize that?
Yeah.
Well, in some sense, I also wouldn't link it to some form of morality where they know, like, oh, I'm going to be doing this evil thing, taking this all away from everyone.
It's more just like to provide for yourself.
Yes, right. Which, well, in the sense also for yourself, but also for there is no morality sense for it. It's not like I'm going to hurt everyone else and take this away from them.
There's I hesitate to call it philosophical, call it a sociological preposition. Talking about the value of trustworthiness, in a society, and for a society, in any society, whether that's human or a naked mole rat colony, for trustworthiness to be valuable, and trustworthiness can be far more valuable than self-centeredness and valuing your own. Trustworthiness isn't the right word. Selflessness. Selflessness is far more valuable than selfishness once it reaches a critical mass in the population. There has to be a certain point where the good provided by it outgrows the individual loss that each person meets. And that will eventually happen. But for that to happen in a mole rat colony, some arbitrary number, 70% of the females after a deposition
Mm-hmm.
would have to decide, hey, let's just be chill. And actually a monarch colony, it wouldn't, because one queen going and sterilizing everyone else ruins it. If all of them decided, hey, let's not be evil, let's not sterilize people unwillingly, they would thrive. They would spread so far.
Sure.
In fact, that might even eventually be at their detriment. They might outgrow their habitat. But that's another deal.
Well, they've seemed to still also prosper with the way that it's not like they're extinct also. So
right.
It is interesting because
they probably
you see that. Yeah, they would have to. They've had to in some way. It's because it's interesting because I would be hesitant to say even when you relate it to some form of morality too, because it's like there isn't. It doesn't, because as you said, it may not actually even benefit them if they were to start actually all just reproducing, because it would cause this stance where everything it could overexpand.
Right.
But so does the queen? Is she the only one that has the capability to sterilize everyone else? Is that one of those this mystifying?
That's my understanding of it. I could be incorrect.
Could anyone take a position as queen if they
possible.
were to?
But I think it's a hormonal thing. If I had to guess, this is beyond my knowledge.
Okay.
I would assume that when you take up the role of queen, your natal hormones are what are causing that issue. When you somehow by ingesting them or some byproduct of them, the others are sterilized. Because if anybody cross-contaminating the produce section would cause issues like that, they wouldn't exist. It just wouldn't work because everybody would be sterile.
It's interesting because it would show that there is some form of hierarchy of what they need.
Well, I mean, you think about in a human perspective,
Sure.
people are designed in a sense to crave achievement and high standing. People, while being in a elevated position isn't all that's needed for happiness, we gain some form of pleasure from it.
Sure.
And that implies that there's some biological mechanism that's rewarding us for seeking achievement, I suppose.
Is that where's the line between instinctive and because at some point you could also start making the claim that humans have because humans do have a moral sense. They're aware of the decisions that they're making because they can go against that instinctive nature.
I think the line that you're going to draw is largely dependent on your worldview.
Okay.
I think that humans are different.
Sure.
I have a religious reason to believe so.
Yes.
You do as well.
Yep.
Even then, where we place the line might be slightly different depending on the nature of God. But if I look at it purely secularly, there's no objective difference. What I might cite is the fact that as humans, the elements that we at one point would just call instinct have developed to the point where we can actively control them.
Sure.
Let's think of a good example. A starfish.
Sure.
That's actually a really interesting animal because they are so ridiculously simple biologically, which is still crazy complex. But the way that they live is their eyes are just blank photoreceptors, right? I see dark, I see light. Some of them can see on a gradient, but it doesn't really matter. They see stimuli. As things suddenly get dark, that's probably a big predator. I'm going to start digging or shuffling or hiding. That's purely instinctive. A starfish cannot teach themselves to behave differently. If I present stimuli over and over and over, they're going to react the same way every single time. They're not complex enough to change.
Sure.
As I climb the taxonomical ladder,
Yes.
or I guess that would be, it doesn't matter. I'm going off on a tangent.
Sure.
Going up towards a reptile.
Mhm.
Eventually, they can become accustomed to certain things, but that they would never do that themselves, I don't think. A reptile is not going to repeatedly expose itself to its fears to try to overcome them. Their fears are a driving factor in their decision
keep them
making.
safe. Yes.
Right. A human, I think of a baby, right?
Sure.
You've heard babies, young babies, like newborns, have like swimming responses. If you put them in water, they will try to float. And they're fairly successful at it. That's instinctive. There's an element of instinct in humans. Our flight or flight response, it's instinctive. I'm not choosing to be scared because a dog barks behind me. Or I get jump scared in a video game. That's natural. It's something we can't control. But if I'm afraid of heights and I decide I'm going to get over it and I expose myself to heights, I'm going to become accustomed to that. A little mouse is going to fear a cat. They're not going to show up and keep presenting themselves to cats. Now, if you give them food, if the cat was guarding something, and you just showed them that, hey, that's actually an interesting point. I think I may have chosen an animal slightly too high to make that example. Because if a mouse has been exposed to traps and they know what they'll do, they'll avoid them, right? But if there's a faulty trap with bait on it, and they learn that trap is faulty, they'll keep coming back to it. And they'll keep taking the bait because they know that one, even though it should scare them.
They don't know exactly. Do they? But it's not an awareness why. It's that someone else was not, rather than dying when they went to that trap, they were informed that it didn't, so they could always come back to it.
Do they understand the concept?
Yes. Do they actually know? Are they actually aware that this one is faulty, or is it just the sense of, this one's different because what's the difference then if they're to see a different trap?
So is the distinction then awareness, comprehension?
Or is it just the fact of knowing that this one's not the same, and I don't know why, but
actually, based on what we're talking about, I'm starting to kind of put together a spectrum.
Sure.
A starfish is purely instinctual. You get to reptiles, small animals, small mammals, and you start getting to the ability to know things. A starfish doesn't know that shadow is bad. They just know it's a shadow and I have to run from those. Or dig from those, or whatever starfish do, which is not much.
Where's the line? Because in some sense, I would say some of these things of knowing and awareness could still be classified within an instinctive view, because the way that they're going to respond to any form of lack of knowledge, because a lot of these things, it is rather clear why they're dangerous if something's dangerous to them. Because it's still, I would relate some of them still to a fact of instinct that they know, I still need to avoid this. Maybe there's some curiosity, but if they purely saw that this is a danger to me, I think they would act out of that danger too.
Yeah.
Because my question more is, because the struggle with saying knowing isn't instinct is because I would still think that they could be aware of something, but they're still going to act with that knowledge in an instinctive way.
A better word than knowing might be recognition.
Sure. Okay.
Now, starfish, and it's all stacked against them. They have no way of recognizing stimulus. They just receive it and act accordingly. In fact, most of their
so everything's
systems,
reactionary.
It's all reactionary, which is all that's required to be considered alive, right? It works. But a mouse or a lemur or something small, and lemurs are actually pretty smart. So mice and rats, classic test subjects. They have the ability to recognize traps. If some sicko shows them mice dying in a rat trap, they won't go to it. They understand the dangers. But
They also have some very interesting group habits, though. When even the way they play, because I've heard studies where they do all that, where it's they still have this hierarchy they follow. It's because it's
sheep.
Yes.
Sheep are dumb.
Yes.
Historically dumb. It's ridiculous. There's a story, I want to say it's from Turkey, where a farmer has 200, or a shepherd has 200 sheep.
Sure.
And one of them falls off of a cliff, and the other 200 follow. And by the end, only 50 sheep survive because they land on what's effectively a giant pillow at the bottom of the cliff, which is ridiculous.
Yes. They follow the person in front of them.
Sheep, specifically, like livestock sheep, are a result of ridiculous amounts of inbreeding and domestication. They're stupid because we wanted them to be.
Sure. So in that sense, do you think what would be a relative comparison to something if they weren't if they weren't domesticated in the way that we've domesticated them, what would they be easily comparable to?
Because they're related really closely. It's like mountain rams.
Sure. It's part of that same family area.
Yeah. And they aren't quite as dumb. I mean, a mountain ram, but they're also not herd animals.
Sure. They have to act. A lot of them still act in herds, but it's not the same type of, it's not like they're being reactionary where they need everyone else, or you can see them alone too. Right. So there's that sense where I wonder where that line of how, if they were similar to this, have they always been lower because of this herd standard that they're in, or is it, if we've made them worse, I wonder where they comparably
herd animals have existed. I think zebras.
True.
They're herd animals. Brutal, by the way. They hurt and kill and maim more zookeepers a year than any other animal.
It's interesting.
Yeah,
I don't know that.
They're brutal.
Is there a greater amount of them to cause them to?
That's a possibility, but I don't know. That's a good question. But
I'm just wondering if they're a herd type of animal, often they would probably come in herds.
Yeah. I mean, generally, a zoo will take like 2 to 5.
Yeah.
Depends on the size of the zoo.
I guess in reality, a lot of animals come in that amount too. So maybe it would also then demonstrate it could just be the zebra.
Zebras, talking about consciousness, the difference between a eusocial colony and a herd like zebras is that they still value their individual reproductive habits. A male zebra will, if they find one of the female zebras under their umbrella in their domain has been with another male zebra and had a foal, they'll kill the foal. They will terminate pregnancies if they didn't cause them. Their desire is to be the sole reproducing male, right? And that gets back to the idea of consciousness, right? Are they more or less conscious, more or less aware? Or is that instinctive? There's clearly no social system.
And it's not like they're being impacted by, this is the standard that we keep, so I'm just going to copy what's been done too. They are, in that sense, their actions are brutal compared to other species, but they're still acting within their...
Dogs and dolphins, when members of their pods or packs, both herd animals technically, when they die, they mourn. When a pup dies, a mother will be devastated. And there's some degree of that too with female zebras, but generally they just go along with it. It's like, oh, that baby's gone. Let's start another one. It's brutal. And when we look at animals that most people would say are conscious, like, be careful with my words, like dolphins and dogs, and compare them to a zebra, there's a deficit.
Sure.
There. There's a difference. what that is exactly, I don't know. That's something for a neuroscientist. But there's clearly a difference. That
Sure.
much is recognizable.
That's clear. Huh. I find, because it's very interesting when you look at the fact that there is so much difference, and even as the progression, because we started with these creatures like ants, when you see them that have this pure stance where they have no desire to live, they don't have a care if they die, but they also don't, in that same sense, care if someone else dies besides the queen.
Mm-hmm.
And you get higher and higher to these creatures that still, and you would look that they don't have a morality of, but they know but they understand that they do care about reproducing, which will cause them to have greater value of their own.
Well, you also see that as intelligence and brain capacity increases, it goes from, sociality is the pariah, right?
Yes.
They're the weird ones outside. Starting from the really low intelligences like starfish and lobsters, right? I'll leave talking about lobsters to others, but there's enough of that out there already. Looking at them, it's instinctive.
Mm-hmm.
To say that a lobster eating another lobster is morally wrong, no, he saw food, he grabbed it. They don't have the ability to determine right and wrong, whereas some people might argue a dog does. Others would say you're just training them good behavior.
Well, in the sense
behavior.
because my hesitance is they also know you can train them, but they also know the type of behavior that's going to cause them to be rewarded.
Right.
If you give them a treat when they do something, they know that this behavior is what my owner wants. This is what this person that I need, they bring me my food. You're making them reliant on you. So they feel that sense where they also know that I want to please them for my own benefit, which in some sense you don't blame them. That's, I think we give them a lot of human characteristics where we think they want to personify their care for us, when in reality they also are just trying to get what they need, and they know what to do to get that.
There are instances, and I think this is one of the key characteristics of a conscious being, is dogs will make choices knowingly that do not benefit them for the sake of someone else. Not just other dogs, but people. A dog going and... I'm trying to think of a good example. I saw a video, it was probably 1 or 2 days ago, so very recently, of a man in a pickup truck driving down the highway, and a little dog jumps out in the road in front of him, just starts running in circles, and thinking like, okay, the dog just doesn't understand. Well, no, the dog knows he's in danger. Then a deer jumping out in front of a car recognizes that this isn't going to go well. That's why they give you that look, right? The dogs understand that too. Well, what do you know? Off to the side of the road, there's a literal baby crawling just out by itself, somehow escaped the house and is going to crawl out onto the road. The dog jumps out into traffic to say, like, hey, somebody needs to come help. The dog is going to die. He's putting himself in mortal jeopardy.
What if the chances the dog knows that he's going to get a treat for saving the baby, and the owner will be so happy that he's going to get everything he wants.
Spoiled, man. That's like getting hit by a bus on campus to get free college, right?
Hey, and people do that.
They do. I think
but I understand where the
threat of
I don't want to use there is a threat, and they know that. It also demonstrates that they're not if it were purely about them, there wouldn't be the desire. Even if it were for the fact that they would get a treat, that wouldn't overpower the fact that they wouldn't be alive to have the treat. So in that sense, where there is that connection, which is interesting, because it's still like you wouldn't give them any moral sense, but that you also know that there may be a closer connection that those type of animals will have than even other animals will have with humans.
Dolphins are a interesting specimen. Somewhere going from highly intelligent animals to humans.
Mm-hmm.
Some people would argue those are still just highly intelligent animals.
Sure.
But regardless, there's a shift. At the bottom, there's a similar shift where we go from not being capable of care to only caring about yourself, right?
Mm-hmm.
Going up in intelligence, you start caring about others. And then there's kind of a flip in mentality with humans, where suddenly, and this could be just a lack of other data. Humans are the only sentient species on the planet. That so it could just be a fluke, right?
Sure.
But humanity cares chiefly for humanity.
Well, we also value the fact that we are sentient.
Right. That could certainly be a part of it. I'm not valuing this in any sense.
Sure. I more mean we give ourselves more value, which
Right.
I would consider,
I think it's just.
which is, yeah, exactly.
Mm-hmm.
I would consider, because we have the awareness, that we even are showing respect to animals
Mm-hmm.
that aren't aware of this.
The-
that is
Mhm.
our duty.
The point I'm getting at is that that's not a uniquely human trait.
Yeah.
Dolphins.
Sure.
Technically, cetaceans in general includes whales, and I think a couple other things. This is one of the subjects I've studied very extensively. It's a huge interest of mine. Dolphins are kind of interesting. We read about them often as kids. The dolphin rescues a sailor,
Mm-hmm.
brings him back to the ship. Such a fluke. Dolphins are terrible. Dolphins care about dolphins, and they only care about the dolphins that are in their pod.
Mm-hmm.
They will, anything that's not a dolphin, human, fish, inanimate object, they will attack, they will torture, they will sodomize. They will do terrible things. Doesn't matter if they're living, if they're dead. Doesn't matter how much they cry and squeal. It's terrible. And the question is, what happens in that gap between dolphins and humanity? Obviously, even people who believe in evolution, dolphins and humans are on different branches.
Yeah.
We share a common ancestor somewhere theoretically.
Mm-hmm.
But
it's interesting that they still separate them, and they would say they're the closest in intelligence.
The correlation is what I'm
yes
hinting at here, not necessarily a genetic continuation. If humans were a little bit less intelligent, do you think we'd be more like dolphins?
Well,
is it our intelligence that allows us to see the value of other species?
No, I wouldn't relate it to intelligence. I feel like there's a difference between and I don't feel like the higher intelligence we are given causes sentience, us to be sentient. Because I would think that
is it the sentience?
I think sentience is what gives us the feeling that we need to, because we're aware, the fact that we are here and we have to respect what we've been given to.
Yeah,
I think that dolphins don't have that value of themselves, of others in that case, because they aren't aware of everything. It is just their mindset of this is this.
Going back to, I talked about viewpoints earlier. From a evolutionary secular standpoint, you could attribute that the valuing of other life, some people more than others.
Yeah.
It's not a constant.
Sure.
I'm thinking of the right way to say this. Some people would say that it's purely just societal.
Sure. Where there actually isn't a value to it. We're instilling it in that we're saying there is value. Are you saying to us or to animals?
To us.
Okay.
We understand that there is value in them because we eat meat, we use animal products, and we generally like cute things. You're never going to treat a spider the same way that you would treat a puppy. No human would.
Mm-hmm.
Even people who say they would, subconsciously, the attraction to things that are baby-like, cute, and small.
So it's all the personification of
Yeah.
them in reality. Okay.
It's
But also the fact is, the something like a spider wouldn't have the. It's not going to display. It's going to run.
Mhm.
It's not going to whimper in front
yeah,
of you.
it's not gonna pretend to be a baby.
Yes.
It's not gonna fall into that. From a religious point of view,
Yes.
specifically a Christian,
Yes.
Judeo-Christian one, humans hold the responsibility
Yes.
of maintaining the earth.
And
That was
sure.
responsibility directly given to us by God.
Would you consider the fact that we're aware of that? Well, because I would relate that with the fact that we are aware that we, like, that's the whole thought of when I'm saying sentient. We're given that responsibility, but the fact that we're aware that this is the responsibility we're given
Mhm.
is why it's there. Because I would also say that then in that case,
Mhm.
God gave the sentient. Well, that's
Mhm.
because that's what defines us differently than everything
Right.
else, is that sentient. Because the ability for us to be more intelligent comes from the ability of us to be sentient, because we're aware that we're not fully knowing.
Mhm.
That's what would cause us to desire intelligence. I would consider
that makes sense.
If that makes sense, I don't know.
Yeah.
It's more that fact of, I'm like, we're given this need to, but we're also given this awareness that we're like, and as a result, we're given this responsibility. But I think that that's almost, even in this case, we're aware of that, and you would have to almost go against that awareness to choose to not value what you're given.
Right. Now, that is actually something, and this is quite a tangent.
Sure. I love tangents.
Yeah.
That's the whole podcast.
I wrote a paper. Actually, I'm still writing it. I was doing this morning before I came here. It's a final for a class I'm taking this term. Was talking about what a world. So let's backtrack. Let's make a hypothetical world, where at some point fairly early on, it is hypothesized and objectively proven that neither God nor the afterlife exists. What effect does that have on humanity?
Then what we value, what we care about, the priorities we keep, everything would be altered. Even the fact of people that wouldn't believe in any of those wouldn't see any value in life. There isn't any sense that, which a lot of people there are people that have come to that conclusion, but even the fact that a lot of them, they deny any sense of hope, but I would think they would still have hope. So,
yeah, that's the key difference. This isn't a world where religion is just frowned upon. This is objectively proven, right? What happens in this world? Morals are the first thing I think of. What happens to the moral foundations? Some people, I've spoken with people who say, like, oh, there'd just be no morals. It'd be anarchy. Society would be ruined. There'd be nothing. And I don't quite go that far. There'd be some semblance of a moral code. But what reason would there be to follow it?
there wouldn't be any
more.
Yeah.
I should clarify. What reason would there be to follow it any more than is immediately visible?
You wouldn't have any incentive. There would be no desire.
I may desire to keep up my societal presence.
But in some sense, that's just then for yourself too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It is. I want to have a good relationship with the people around me.
Sure.
I want to potentially attract a mate. I want to have a family, and I want to breed them into this terrible world too. Right? So I'm going to...
No wonder a lot of people in the world consider it such an evil to bring children.
Right. So that's part of it.
Yeah.
I don't think society collapses on that front.
Mm-hmm.
What I'm tying this in from is that idea that morals are defined by a creator, right? Mm-hmm. Even a hypothetical one. We're both Christian. We both believe in the Christian God.
Yes.
But somebody who believes in a hypothetical God, or
they still are instilled with some value because they were created by that God.
There's a philosophical toy, kind of, um, a, a method of rationalizing human belief. I also need to look at the name. I'm very terrible with the names.
That's okay.
So talking about morals, talking about what happens to morals without a god in the picture. And this goes back to the 15th, 16th century.
Sure.
Don't quote me on that. That's not what's important.
Sure. But it's in the past.
A philosopher, Pascal, makes Pascal's triangle, all those mathematical things, comes up with an explanation, a proof in a sense of God, which I don't think is possible. There's flaws with this approach. Something we can go over, actually. This method that he uses is flawed, but I think it's still practical. This idea that if we look at a risk cost kind of a system of, do I believe, do I not believe, right? If I believe in a hypothetical God and he is real, then I gain positive eternal reward, infinite value, right? If I believe in a God and he isn't real, I lose some margin of value on earth. I personally, in my own life, I believe that following on earth and the benefits on earth are positive. I don't see that as a negative, but for the sake of this example, if I don't believe in God and he is real, I have a negative loss. Eternity, right? Negative infinity.
Yeah.
And if I don't believe in God and he is real, I gain some marginal utility on earth, right? And he isn't real, I gain some marginal utility on earth. It more or less shows that in the presence of infinite gain for some particularly unlikely cause, it's worth it, right? Even if there's a 10% chance God is real, there's infinite value in believing he is. I do believe God is real, to be clear, but this method is flawed.
Yes.
It's actually a really interesting thought experiment. With this methodology in mind, I'm going to give you a scenario, and you have to just think about this.
Sure.
So that is called Pascal's wager. Given those probabilities, what would you bet on? With infinite reward, if you say yes, infinite loss if you say no, and only a marginal chance of either thing happening, you'll pick the infinite reward, right? It only makes sense. So you're walking home. You just gave the Ethan Barros podcast 100th episode extravaganza.
We've been going for a while.
Yeah, you've really just taken
I hope you guys stuck through to the end.
And you're walking home and a mugger steps out.
Okay.
And he says, "You're going to give me your wallet." He says, "Well, do you have a weapon?" And he says, "No, I don't have a weapon. But I'm God. And if you don't give me your wallet, you're going to be condemned to hell." Pascal's wager says you give him your wallet.
Yeah.
Even if there's a tiny, tiny chance he's God, the infinite reward of going to heaven makes it worth it, right? It's weird.
Besides the fact he's not God and he's trying to steal from me.
Clearly he's not God, but the infinite reward makes it worth it.
Sure.
Right? It's a way of demonstrating that thought process is not effective. I believe in God, which means that I believe that conclusion in Pascal's wager is correct. But for somebody, an outside observer looking at this, it doesn't.
You can easily manipulate the system, and it almost only works in the fact that, well, it even just seems more like you're trying to justify it to yourself.
Well, yeah, and
that's the wager sounds more like I need to justify this for my own sake.
If you add one more step to the wager, you realize that it means nothing.
Well, the fact is, you're saying one God, but then consider all the gods that are
Let's look at the wager again, but we have three possibilities. So in one column, it's like a Punnett square, right? In one column, it's does exist, doesn't exist, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you have believe in God, believe in some anti-God with all the opposite values of God,
Okay.
or don't believe in God, right? Or don't believe in anti-God. Sure, make it 4.
Sure.
They all cancel out.
Yeah.
It's a neutral decision.
There's no, because in reality you can't remain.
You can.
There's no actual finite nature to it,
Mhm.
because there is a plethora of religious
Mhm.
people that have been around, and even in the fact that you can't use them to have a guidance
Mhm.
of this is what's going to work.
No
That's not how it works.
meaningful information can be taken from Pascal's wager.
Yes.
Is the thesis here, right?
Yes.
That's not to say that religion is a sham.
No.
It's simply to say this way of looking at it. It's a way that, and this is something that bothers me
Sure.
on a fundamental level. A lot of Christians, which the group I have the most experience with, right, look at potential evidence contrary to God's existence and say, that just doesn't make sense. We're just not going to.
You're not asking any questions.
Yeah,
anymore.
it's just like, it's like, well, we're not going to talk about that.
Yes.
Right?
You're very.
That's
And it's been
mhm.
it's been millennia. It's been going on for a long time. Why they've been doing. Well, because the questions, even like you look back in history and the Catholic Church, and then they started the scientific revolution. They're like, we are discounting anything they're doing. Nothing is accurate. And you're like, well, in reality, they're not. Now with time, we've become more acquainted with the fact that, okay, you're not discrediting God when you're looking at these things God has created. Because the fact is, when people, even when they were talking about the atom and all this stuff, it's like, no, God is the foundation of it all. And I'm like, well, God created the atom. What would be your question there? Right. And then with time, people have become, it's more the fact of there's no way that this can't be true. So, and it takes people, and there's some form of stubbornness there because they're living within this mindset that they've given as their reality.
My least favorite argument I have ever heard was given on a stage in one of our churches during a huge convention, right? Where a man stood up on the stage and said, we share 70% of our DNA with a banana. Evolution is clearly not real. I don't believe evolution is real. That's a terrible argument.
Yes.
Our genetics...
Because the claim is that we wouldn't have identical DNA. All the DNA would have been founded through life transitioning in the evolution standard. Well, the fact is that it just doesn't... Because in reality, a better argument for DNA is like, okay, rather than saying, using a common ancestor argument, you say, okay, a common creator who built all life out of the same 4 stances of DNA, the 4 letters that we use. That's the common creator. That would make the more sense. But then you go back to your conclusion.
The banana argument, right? Yes. How many combinations of A, C, G, and T are there?
There's so many.
Right. Yes. But if I limit it, a protein code.
A
protein code is a certain number of those, of amino acids. That's amino acids. What are they? I don't remember. Certain number of those.
I forget the amount, but
ketones long, right? Some arbitrary amount. There's the fact that certain patterns repeat between us and bananas simply means that some of the proteins we have are some of the proteins bananas have.
Yes.
What am I supposed to glean from that about evolution? Of course, bananas. And what I have, actually, I don't know. Do we have we have cellulose in our body? It's not as much as like a tree. Sure, we do have it though. Bananas have cellulose,
but they're all just common.
Right.
That's the reality. It's not because the claim with bananas doesn't match up.
It's no different than saying, and I get that there's a order of magnitude difference on the numbers and the scale, but really there is no difference between saying that evolution isn't real because bananas share DNA with us, than it is saying evolution isn't real because we're both made of atoms.
Well, the reality is that there is no repeated DNA for humans. Everyone's unique, and then the difference is then when you look at this of then but in reality, it is just like a lot of them are like no one's the same. But what do they say? It's only like 1% of your DNA is actually the different amount. And then you look at that, and I'm like, okay, so there's the building block of it.
Right.
And if nothing, well, even if you consider back in time, a better argument you would have to say is, okay, if only this tiny amount has been changing, no wonder they have to give us billions of years so that this 1% would adjust to, and then you could say, okay, then it would reach the 30% to reach the 70. But it can make sense where their argument, but then the DNA that would need to shift to cause that change doesn't shift. Because that's the thought. This 1% are the adjustments that are possible, but these other adjustments that they say would be changing within like the founding, like the building blocks, you don't see those changing. It's the things that are built to change.
There's the issue with science and trying to justify science from a godly worldview is not the evidence. The evidence is irrefutable. It's there. The interpretation is the problem. Science right now, and I say science as a general term, there's fields that are just fine, right? But there's a lot of theoretical science, especially in biology, geology,
physics
everything. As well.
Well, they're theoretical in a sense, but I will say most people in the theoretical sense don't completely comprehend all of that. But
I don't mean theoretical in the
unknown. What do you?
I mean,
theoretical in the way like it's no way to be proven, but we would predict that it's.
I should clarify because that's an issue. That's incorrect, or what I said was incorrect. The issue is with is not with the evidence; it's with the interpretation and the over infatuation with certain paradigms. Modern biologists are a perfect example. We have evidence in place, and they claim that it suggests a certain thing. It can just as easily suggest other things, but they keep going off of hypotheses. Right? Or that's not the right word. Geology. Let's look at geology. This one's simpler. We were talking about biology and evolution. Geology gives a good example of this. They claim everything took millions and billions of years, rocks sliding across each other. That's perfectly feasible. That's a fair interpretation of the data.
But they're not.
You can interpret it other ways.
Yes, they're not giving other defining events the opportunity to also influence it too.
I've talked about demonstrations I didn't like. One I did talked about the Grand Canyon. And a lot of creationists point to the Grand Canyon and get everything wrong, right? They say this is proof of the flood, and this is proof of this, and this is proof of that, and I say don't throw that away. That there is evidence of movement in very short time spans. Does that prove the flood? Maybe. What it does prove is that there's reason to doubt the long-term slow movement paradigm.
Which is what they would use as evidence of this is taking millions of years to change to where it is, or thousands.
Carbon dating is often used on fossils and stones. I have issues with carbon dating.
Well, most people. Well, and the fact is that they even know that it's inconsistent in the first place.
It is incredibly inconsistent, but even more than that, the difficulty with fossils, and this is something that people don't often understand, and admittedly, I'm not an expert on radiology. This is complicated stuff.
Neither of us are.
We're not experts
in
this is purely my understanding. Perhaps my understanding failing. But it's my understanding. Fossils are not bones. They're ossifications of bones. Bones do slowly decompose, and as they do that, minerals from deposits, from leaving different solutions, slowly take the place. The dinosaur bones that are in the that are in like the Smithsonian and things like that, they aren't bones.
They're fossilized
They're
bones.
they're rocks.
Yes, yes.
They look like bones because there used to be bones there. But that doesn't mean that those bones were from the same carbon era as, well, look, if everything was made, 6,000 is the number that we like to throw around, but even 50,000 years ago.
Sure.
All of the carbon is going to decay at similar rates, right? It's just going to slowly follow that curve. There are going to be statistical outliers. That's part of the reason why it's inconsistent.
Yes.
Is that a sample can decay slower or faster. But with this carbon flowing into these fossilized remains, and sorry, I'm having issues,
That's right.
and taking over that space, wasn't that carbon aging the whole time? All of it's coming from the same time point, which brings me back to the beginning, which is God created the heavens and the earth, right?
Yes.
How do we know the ratio of carbon isotopes from when God made the earth? We have a curve that says that billions of years ago it was here.
Yes.
Right? But if the earth was created here, all that's needed to justify creation from a radiological sense is to place the creation where carbon was here.
Yes.
Right? That could be a failure in my understanding. Certainly. I'm not suggesting I have proof of creation here. I'm saying there's a reason to question.
When they're doing carbon dating, it's the breakdown of the carbon, and that's the relation.
Right.
So when the carbon breaks down, what's the result of, like, what's the resultant? What remains when carbon breaks down?
There's an unstable isotope. Are you familiar with
not all
term?
Of this? Okay. Oh no, isotope.
An isotope, right? It has a different number of neutrons.
Sure. There's a sense I don't know how many of our listeners will be aware of stuff.
That's a good point. I have a tendency to over explain things or under explain things a bit, whichever one's the right word. You know what I mean?
I know what you're saying.
Certain carbon atoms, a certain percent, are when they fused and became carbon, or when they were created in a creation sense, they had a different number of neutrons, a subatomic particle, than normal. And trying to cram that neutron in made them unstable.
Yes.
So what's going to happen is that unstable isotopes have what's called a half-life. It's not a date that they're going to split. It's a point that says, at this date, statistically speaking, 50% of this isotope are going to have decomposed. They're going to have thrown off a neutron as beta radiation.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Okay.
And they're going to become a stable isotope. So scientists, by some means, a means I don't understand, and if I understood it, I could explain if I had issue with it, but I don't know.
Sure.
They determined that when, hypothetically, the Big Bang happened, a certain percentage of carbon atoms were of this unstable isotope.
Okay.
Given the half-life of that isotope,
they should be existing.
It should point. The ratio should be here.
Sure.
Now, under certain circumstances, that can be slowed down, which means that individual pockets or individual sources may be at a different point by, like, say, cooling it down, I think is one way. But we have no way of knowing what individual carbon samples that we just dug up came through. If it pertains to ice, right? We know of the ice ages. We know of large points, but we don't know where that bone was. There was still green on the earth for almost all of hypothetical history, right? Sure. And likely they were far underwater, far underground. When this ossification was happening, we don't know the circumstances. So what we do, we make a prediction. We make a prediction that says we expect that it was from this time range. And that prediction is based off of the odds that 50% of a given carbon isotope will have decomposed. So there's uncertainty. This isn't
A lot of uncertainty.
a lot of uncertainty. Now, there's a degree of the saving grace for carbon dating is the sheer scale.
Mhm.
If I roll a dice or flip a coin, flipping a coin's a better one because it's like heads split, tails stay the same.
Sure.
If there's 1 trillion atoms and I flip a coin for each one at the half-life,
Yeah.
I should expect almost exactly 50%.
Yeah.
But so the uncertainty there exists, but it's small. I think most of the uncertainty comes from the conditions under which the fossils were kept while we didn't know they existed. Right? How do I know? I know roughly based on geographical data that this bone would be in the same spot 6,000 years ago than it was now. Right? But
Sure.
I don't know what the world was like then.
Well, even the fact,
considering the fact that we found it, it wasn't that deep.
Yes.
Right? So it's exposed to the surface. I don't know who did what to it. I don't know what did what to it. It's not a huge difference, but it just introduces that little bit more of uncertainty. And from a system that's already based off of propositions and hypothesis, speculation is the better word. There's a consensus. I assume it's reasonably made on what the original carbon-14 content was, right? But I don't know how that was made. I don't know how reasonable that assumption is. It could be very reasonable. I don't know. But
in some sense, you also the fact is,
I also know that the people
there.
who made that believed that the Earth was billions of years old,
Yes.
4.5 billion.
Well, even the questions when you have to look at the facts of the environment that it's living in, because you even have to consider the influences that would have been outside of. You don't know what the world was. You don't know how the atmosphere, how everything's influenced. Because even the fact is, okay, if the universe is always expanding, these forces have changed. New material in that sense is being created, and then matter is being created, and not created, but in the sense where it's expanding. There's this thought where you can't really constrict one thing so small, because if you were to say it's not changing, these other influences outside of Earth, which we don't completely understand, there's a lot of uncertainty. And in some sense, you know what, I respect people who, even scientists, which I know I don't believe what they will always say, but speak in a sense where you're not speaking in dogmatic, this is the way it is, or this is not the way it is, because you
100%.
don't know. They don't know.
I don't quite understand what you're saying with, I understand that part, that
Yes.
much of it I agree with. Talking about matter, the expansion of the universe and matter being created. If I can assume you're talking about just general uncertainty.
More in the sense of you don't know how these things will influence. Well, if we're stating that there's this amount of carbon in the universe, and if there's more matter being created, or if things are expanding, the influence of different forces, which we don't completely understand.
Theoretically, there could be an effect.
It's more just all these things are theoretical. And I'm in some sense, yes, I don't even have as much knowledge on all these things too. I'm more speaking the stance of, I've done stuff and I've looked at a lot of more physics-based stuff because I find that more interesting. And the fact is, there's a lot of questions, and the people, the scientists that I know I have disagreements or I would disagree with, but I respect them far more when they account for and they say I don't know.
Well, yes,
and it's in some sense, because it's like some of these things, yes, I might even be incorrect on the facts of expansion, all these, when you reference inflation, all these theoretical ideas that have been created. that you're like, okay, we don't know how all of this will react, and we don't even know how Earth is going to react to the influences of a universe that's changing, because that's known.
The Bible talks
Yes.
about, specifically during Genesis, about the flood. It says that like the waters of the deep open up, and it's raining. A lot of biblical scholars talk about, there was an ice shell around the earth that melted and let all the water down, and I just kind of scratch my head at that, right?
Yeah.
I sit here reading this stuff, and I have a professor I'm working with right now, very knowledgeable, who kind of doesn't tolerate that nonsense.
Yeah.
It's very much just like, well, look, this is what the Bible says. I don't know where you're trying to stuff scripture into places to make it work.
Yeah.
And that's just as wrong as the scientists are doing.
Yeah.
The issue isn't that they just keep bringing this dirty evidence to the table, right? I can't believe that they would bring evidence, right? It's insane. The issue is that, and I respect a lot of scientists for the work that they do, especially ones who, like you said, are willing to say, well, that's a possibility. I believe differently, but that could be a potential work too. Even scientists who say, well, actually, here's why I don't agree with that.
Sure.
That's fine. It's okay to interpret things differently.
Well, even the fact that if you were to have a different conversation with someone, and the fact that they disagree, but they at least respect you as a person, there's a difference there too.
I watched, I don't know if you've seen it. Bill Nye.
Yeah.
Bill Nye the Science Guy, right?
The engineer?
Yeah. The childhood idol, right?
Yes.
I remember watching a
debate.
Oh, not the Ken Burns debate. That was cool though. Watching a video about how there's like pro wrestlers with more degrees than him.
Sure.
But obviously I don't have a esteemed degree, right? That's not what's important. Just poking fun. I don't like the way that he handles things.
Yes, because he reacts in the strong, like, this is the way it is. And that's the struggle with him.
Even more than that, it's not just that.
That's what I've gotten frustrated when I've watched some of these things he'll do, where
he doesn't talk about the possibilities.
Yes.
He doesn't tolerate exaparadigmal thought, things that are outside of the general framework that he believes in. He's going to start calling you a moron and an idiot.
He's the go-to for the people who, he's one of those people that he has more knowledge than most people, but if you were to bring him next to an expert, the expert would know far more than he. It's more like he's the one they're going to go to say the things that they want to hear.
Well, the issue I have, right?
Sure.
I shouldn't say one of the issues I have is he has demonstrated that he is willing to adapt to evidence. I disagree with him on this as well, to be clear. In one of his early specials, the Bill Nye the Science Guy show, he was talking about human anatomy, and he talked about gender. He says there are two genders. There are male and female. This is the traits of one. This is the traits of the other. I don't remember the year. It doesn't matter. He gives a big presentation about the gender identity spectrum and how all of these different things are so much more complicated than we thought before. And I disagree. But clearly, he came across some evidence and changed his mind, right? He was willing to look at that evidence and say, okay, let's take it for what it's worth. I'm going to read this. I'm going to learn from it. And I'm going to adjust my mindset based on this evidence and my interpretation of it.
Where's the line between changing your mind with an open mind and also being coerced where you become not open-minded? Because the struggle with that would be, I don't know if I would define that as open-minded as much as also being influenced by those
pop
around
culture.
You. Yes, exactly. Where he was this pop culture icon, this this idol that was played in every middle school 7th grade
Mhm.
classroom. I remember the days.
Right.
And the struggle there is I'm like, okay, so clearly he knows his place.
Mhm.
He wasn't seen as this. And even I wonder if he recognized early on he's not going to be seen as this high intellectual expert that's going to be brought in to have. He's going to have some debates, but it's not going to be. He's not the reference point for debates that you're not the expert you're going to bring
Neil
on.
deGrasse Tyson, right?
Yes. And that's the concern there, where he's not this true expert in that sense, where
Mhm.
but he was brought in because of because of his how known he was. And he might be influenced by
Mhm.
that too.
So the main idea that I'm getting at here is
Sure.
this idea that what's different about religion, right? Why is religion treated in the scientific community like an utter impossibility? It has not been disproven. There are some religions that say things that are wacky. I understand that. Some people would say there's things Christians say that are wacky. There are things other Christians say that are wacky, like the fact that bananas disprove evolution, right? But that shouldn't disclude Christianity and religion in general from the discussion. People from all throughout history have believed in religions, various ones. And whether or not there's credibility in most of them, there's a reason in and of itself, the fact that so many people have been in religions,
Mm-hmm.
to consider them. I'm not saying you have to adopt them. I'm not saying you have to believe in them.
Well, a lot of them have stood the test of time.
Mhm.
There's a reason that even the facts that if you don't look at, some people would make the claim that, it's just because it was there.
Mhm.
But the facts is, if you don't believe what Christianity says, it's existed, this form of Christianity, and then you go back in Judaism before that, we've
Mhm.
seen it's been around for 2,000 years at this point. It's like
Mhm.
there has been a test of time that's been maintained, and there has been changes where you'd see the Protestant Reformations and all these things, but there has been this.
If you want
time.
an example
Yes.
of religion working today,
Mm-hmm.
where someone prayed to a god and something happened. Now, that's an example. It's evidence. It's not necessarily a nail in the coffin, right? It's just evidence. Take me. I have a birth defect affecting my ears, my inner ears. I get frequent infections. I have a lot of problems. When I was 13, we just moved here to Portland, Oregon, and I had a terrible ear infection, and it happened before. We were on some antibiotics. It was fine until during class, I suddenly stopped being able to hear because my eardrum, my left ear is deaf. My right eardrum burst due to pressure due to the infection. The infection was preventing it from healing afterwards. The doctor did not expect a recovery. We had surgery. We had reparations done where I had a graft. They basically took skin and replaced my eardrum. It was a whole deal, and it wasn't taking. And it didn't work, right? Until we went in at one point. The pain just stopped. We prayed. It stopped. We went into the doctor's office, and it was healed. I had an eardrum. The graft took. The graft wasn't taking. It was like dying. The skin was dead. So it was getting removed, right? And we went in, and it's healthy, right? Now, that's something that you can go in. I can go into my doctor. I still see the same doctor. He still, almost every time I go in, I just don't understand how that thing healed, man. That was insane. I could go in and ask for the pictures of the, what are they, otoscope? Not otoscopes, audioscopes, whatever they're called. Little cameras they stick in your ears. They use a microscope to look at your eardrum, get all of that information. And then you can see pictures before and after. You could see that it healed when it really shouldn't have. Now, that's not a huge dynamic healing. That's not lepers being made whole. That's not rise up and walk, right? That's a flab of skin in my ear being healed and my hearing being restored. But it's evidence. It's not foolproof. It's anecdotal. There's
Sure.
pictures, sure, but why isn't evidence like that considered?
Because of the anecdotal attitude people don't respect,
Mhm.
or in the type of scientific community,
Right. Well,
you
what about
don't hear that.
the pictures? My
Sure.
ears clearly was not supposed to heal.
Well, there's a sense that people will
They
explain things
they
away.
could explain it.
Yeah.
But almost
Yeah.
nobody in the
Yeah.
scientific community would consider that as an option.
Hmm.
Um, another person, another
Yeah.
case, pregnant couple, right? Keeping it anonymous for the sake of anonymity,
Yep.
right?
Yep.
And they go and they're doing some prenatal tests. They get, what is it called? An ultrasound done. And the doctor comes in. He's like, look, we got a problem. There's, I don't know if they're growths, but some sign of cystic fibrosis. Their lungs are not going to be able to absorb fluid properly because of a disfigured protein. They're going to fill with water, and they'll probably live to about 20. And that's bad. They had pictures. The ultrasounds were like scanned. You have the pictures still available. And the next one, after going and praying for days, right? It's gone. Now, could it be a faulty reading? Sure. But it is evidence. It's not, people often like to talk about evidence being, we talk about evidence like it's the nail in the coffin, right? I've already used that, the smoking bullet.
Hmm.
I have evidence that my client did not do this, like in all the court shows, right? My client did not kill that man. He was here at the time. They put down a receipt, right? They were at the grocery store at that time. Well, that's not going to end the case. That's an alibi. It's not bulletproof,
Yeah.
but it's still evidence. It needs to be considered. If I if we look at that case, the court case, right? And so, Your Honor, my client has a witness being at his home at that point when the crime happened. Purely anecdotal. Entirely anecdotal. There's no pictures. There's pictures of the ultrasounds and the microscope pictures, right, of my ear. There's no pictures of this guy at this house. The judge is still going to accept it and take it as evidence, right? The jury's going to take that and say, oh, he's got an alibi, right? Now, based on the other evidence, you make a decision. Why don't we do that with religion?
Is this a genuine question?
Yeah,
Or sure.
I don't have an answer. I don't
Sure.
understand.
Well, I think you also have to recognize the type of people often incorporated in, well, to consider the people who often will come to religion are in a desperate need that don't, maybe in some sense, I don't know if they would be moved by this form of evidence. Like they would be amazed, but often they're coming from this desperate need. And if you can use evidence in miracles, well, even in, they talk about it, well, like the Bible, where it's like miracles wouldn't have automatically caused people to all of a sudden be saved or anything.
No.
So
Well, I mean,
these
think of
things,
the
yes.
story of Lazarus, poor man Lazarus, not dead man Lazarus. I guess he's dead too. But the rich man.
Yes.
He is not named in the Bible, but historically he's been called Dives. I don't remember why. Rich man Dives goes to hell. He's like, oh, would you just Lazarus? Would you just touch your tongue or dip your finger in water and touch my tongue? I'm tormented. And he says, let me go back and warn my brothers. Right? He says, you could come back from the dead and tell them, and they wouldn't care. Right? It gets to what I think the moral of that story is: the fundamental unprovability of religion. I don't think you can disprove it. It gets to back towards Pascal's wager, is that it's to some extent reality bending. We're dealing with achronal, not affected by time, a physical being who's all powerful, all knowing. What are his limits? There are none. Who says he should be constrained by evidence? No one. Now, I don't like going there, right?
Sure.
It's not an effective method of convincing people because it's just so fantastical, right?
Well, in
Oh,
reality, that's not really what's going to shift people's
right.
opinion to.
It's like, oh, isn't that just perfect? You have the perfect way to not answer any of my questions, right? That's just going to frustrate people.
True.
But it's true, or at least I believe it is.
I guess that's what they would call faith.
Yeah. And that's what you get at with the paradigms in science, right?
Sure.
People, every Sunday school teacher, oh, it takes just as much faith to believe in evolution, right? It takes just as much faith to hold to their paradigms the way they do. That's the problem. It's not the theories. Theories are fine. It's when you get your theories
and you hold them
and you hold
like
them
their
like
truth.
fact, like truth. Yep. Evolution is still a theory. People say that and misuse the word theory. Yep. Oh, that means they don't know it's true, right? They're pretty sure it is. It's a theory in the same way that the theory of relativity is a theory.
Yeah.
It's the most widely accepted way of describing the universe. But that doesn't mean that you should trash other people's paradigms. I live in a primarily religious paradigm. Other people live in secular paradigms. I really do my best, and I feel like I do a pretty good job of being courteous to those people because it's something I believe I have to do. And this gets back into a topic we were talking about earlier. What reason do they have to do that?
To respect your paradigm?
Purely societal.
Yeah. It's true. They haven't, well, in some sense, there's also a truth that if there's both a responsibility to respect the person, but you also need to, there is some form of responsibility where they don't always see it. They see it if it's their paradigm that they're living in, they want to live in their paradigm too. Where there is a sense within religion too that a false paradigm is a false reality, and it's not your own personal reality. So, which that's the that's the struggle where you have to find that balance where you don't want to be the extreme dogmatic, but you also don't want to justify a person's character.
So, right. Yeah. It gets back to you think about all of these, the scientists are just as dogmatic as the preachers, right? And you have a problem because nobody's listening to each other anymore. Widening the lens a little bit.
Yep.
That seems to be the problem worldwide right now, is that nobody's listening to each other. That saying that and having a solution are different things, right?
Sure.
How do you convince people to listen to each other? What does that actually mean? I don't know. I am a sophomore in college. I don't know. But you think we could start trying, right? I understand that Bill Nye probably believes what he says. And that's a fundamental belief. That's not.
Sure. Well, I even find that, but the fact is that even if they do believe, the fact is that they're living by these principles, and rather, I think that is a big difference where often you do jump to the conclusion that they're just speaking strongly. Like they may not even believe what they're saying. They might just be dogmatic in nature, and that's just how they're going to respond.
How do you debate somebody who doesn't believe what they're saying?
True.
Unless
they're extremely confused.
Yeah, but confused is different because then there
is some people who are blind to even hearing. In that sense, it would be a stubbornness where they're blind to even having their mind changed, even though they know that there are inconsistencies. Because there is a difference there.
A friend of mine, we were having lunch 6 months ago, and he said one of the most wild things I've ever heard. The entire table instantly, it was like the classic scene from all the movies. The forks were dropping out of people's hands. It was like, he says, I believe Sonic the Hedgehog exists because you can't prove to me he doesn't. You say, well, okay, hold on a minute.
There's a lot of things I can't prove to you exist, buddy.
Yeah. How am I supposed... So the problem is you can't prove that he does exist, right? But you choose to believe he exists because I can't prove he doesn't? This sounds like a religion all of a sudden.
Yes. Yes.
It does. And we get to the fundamental problem. It also sounds like a scientific paradigm, right?
Yeah.
You can't prove my paradigm is wrong, so I'm going to stick with it.
Yeah.
Right? And suddenly, we reach an impasse. It goes back to the same issue that we had with Pascal's wager.
Sure.
Right? Evidence is necessary. That's I guess the point. Right? If we discard evidence entirely, if you're a scientist discarding all possible evidence that's going to suggest religion is real, such as miracle stories. There's plenty of people who claim to have had miracles. That's anecdotal evidence, 100%. Don't get me wrong. But it's evidence. You're going to get a skewed view by discarding all of that. Our Sonic the Hedgehog example.
Sure.
Weird as it is. He said the same thing about Bigfoot, right?
Yeah.
You can't prove Bigfoot doesn't exist, so I choose to believe he does.
Yeah.
And you get to an interesting philosophical, strong word.
Sure.
Burden of proof. A logical idea. We talk about logical fallacies.
Sure.
They're a very interesting topic. Whole regions of American history have been defined by logical fallacies. The Red Scare, the wars in Vietnam and Korea were all caused by slippery slope fallacies, right? In government. McCarthyism is one big slippery slope fallacy. Whether or not you believe that those actions were justified, and that's actually a fallacy in and of itself. Just because something is a fallacy doesn't mean it's false. I can come to the right conclusion fallaciously.
So what you're saying is, although living by a principle may have its flaws, you could still reach the right conclusion by hearing it, because you might be aware, but at that sense you're still aware of the
I would not have
fallacy.
A logical base to get to. Well, we're talking about accidentally, but purposefully as well, I suppose. McCarthy, not Kevin McCarthy.
That's too recent.
Too recent. I forget the original McCarthy's name. Started this whole escapade arresting actors and people like that, and he was a strong proponent of the Vietnam War. He says we have to fight in Vietnam, because if South Vietnam falls, then Cambodia is going to fall, then Laos is going to fall, then Thailand is going to fall. And you run into a problem. Say there's a 90% chance that each of those things happens. By the time you get to step 4, you're about a 50% chance of that ever happening.
Yeah.
By the time you get to step 10, you're looking at 0.9 to the 10th power, right?
Yeah.
That's a pretty small number. Just because something is likely doesn't mean it will happen. And especially when you put a very likely event after being caused by a very likely event, the whole mess of things happening is still unlikely. That was a bit of a tangent. We're not talking about slippery slope fallacies. I was just using an example.
It's related.
But just because this idea that we should fight in the Vietnam War because of all of this is going to happen, saying that is fallacious. It's wrong. That's not a logical argument. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't fight in the Vietnam War. You can come to a correct conclusion, and I'm not necessarily saying that we should or we shouldn't have. I'm just saying hypothetically.
Sure. That's the comparison to the situation. Yeah.
You can come to a correct conclusion,
but you don't need to believe that all these other countries are going to fall as a result of us not if we didn't do it. But you might still see the benefit of going
Even though McCarthy got there illogically, his logical steps were incorrect.
Yes.
He still somehow ended up on a potentially correct answer.
Sure.
Depending on who you ask. So
Is having a bad reason, though, also going to cause you to be swayed to make wrong decisions when you're within it, though?
I imagine most often when you make the wrong decision, you'll get the wrong answer. The idea is simply to say that, and this is the issue with most logical fallacies, is that it's what happened. Most logical fallacies arise when you're dealing in absolutes. When I say, because you used a logical fallacy, your answer will be correct, that is not a logically sound statement, because there is some probability that even though you used a logical fallacy in your argument, you've come to the correct conclusion.
True.
Think of it as if you had a student, you told them to add 3 and 5 together. This is something I run into in my job quite often. You can't when I'm grading papers for students, you can't just look at the answer. You have to look at their work, because there's a substantial chance, especially on simpler problems, that they did things wrong, like objectively wrong, and still somehow got the right answer. And that still needs to be corrected, because there's no guarantee they'll get the right answer next time. And explaining that to students is a nightmare, because they're like, why did I have to do it again? It's like, you did it wrong. But
Sure. That makes sense. It makes sense, because there is a truth that people don't like to be corrected, and if they felt like they got to the right result, you still need to recognize that your motivations, even if you're making the right decision and your motivations are wrong, it can cause other people, it can cause yourself in the future to be influenced in the wrong way, because your motivations, you might feel that then it's justified what you did because it turned out right, even though it may have been the right decision, but motivation could also be the wrong reason why you're doing it. Well, I want to thank you for watching. Marcus and I had a great conversation, and I want to thank him for coming. I hope you enjoyed it, but I'm going to end you with a verse, actually, and leave you pondering what it means. Okay, this is Genesis 3:19. In the sweat of thy face shalt thou eat bread, till thou return unto the ground, for out of it wast thou taken. For dust thou art, and unto dust shalt thou return. Thank you for watching.